Okay, everyone, welcome to Capital as Power in the 21st Century. We meet today in the midst of what many academics consider a polycrisis to discuss capital as power in the 21st century. As is well known, we confront many challenges such as climate change, growing inequality, and political and military conflict, but they all are related to the dynamics of capital and its accumulation. Today's discussion is aimed at exploring and critiquing how capital functions as a form of organized power rather than simply as a productive economic asset as traditionally viewed in mainstream economics. This approach, developed by political economists Jonathan Nitzan and Shimshon Bickler, seeks to understand capital not through abstract measures of value or productivity, but through its role in establishing and maintaining social, political, and economic hierarchies. Today, we have with us Jonathan Nitzan, who is a Canadian political economist and professor known for his critical approach to the study of capital as power. He is the co-developer of the capital as power theory, which he introduced with his collaborator, Shimshon Bickler. Nitzan's work challenges traditional economic views of capital and value, arguing that capital is not a productive economic asset, but a tool of organized power used to control and shape social relations. This theory shifts the focus from economic growth and productivity to the ways in which power structures maintain and even increase the monetary value of assets. A prolific writer, he is most famous for the groundbreaking work Capital as Power, a study of order and creorder with Shimshon Bickler. This book eviscerates both neoclassical and Marxist understanding of capital and accumulation and introduces a power theory of value. Blair Fix is also with us today. He is a Canadian political economist and researcher known for his interdisciplinary work on economic inequality, energy, and the structure of social power. His research builds on heterodox economic theories and critiques of mainstream economics, particularly in terms of growth, productivity, and income distribution. Fix is especially interested in the links between energy consumption, social hierarchy, and economic inequality, as well as how these factors affect the environment and long-run sustainability. He is renowned for his book, Rethinking Economic Growth Theory from a Biophysical Perspective, published in 2015, where he challenges traditional economic theories of growth by highlighting the physical and energetic constraints of economic systems. He also blogs at Economics from the Top Down, where he really bugs a lot of economists. It is a blog space which challenges traditional economic thinking. Michael Hudson is also with us today. He is an American economist and professor of economics who has become well known for his critique of modern finance, debt, and the economic structures that perpetuate inequality. Specializing in the history of debt and finance, Hudson examines how debt functions in both ancient and contemporary societies, focusing on its role in wealth redistribution and social control. He is the author of many books and articles, including but not limited to Superimperialism, Global Fracture, and Forgive Them Their Debts, Killing the Host. My name is Tim Muzio. I am a Canadian political economist working in Australia at the University of Wollongong, where I'm an associate professor in international relations and political economy. My major works include Carbon Capitalism, The Tragedy of Human Development, and with Richard Robbins, my co-author, Debt as Power and an Anthropology of Money. I would like now to introduce Professor Jonathan Nitzan to start off our conversation of capital as power in the 21st century.
Thank you, Tim, very much. This was a very eloquent introduction. So, what I want to do in the next 30 minutes or so, 35 minutes, is to present to you the capital as power approach, or CASP as we call it for short. I'll tell you what CASP is first, how it relates to political economy more generally, and most importantly, what it has to offer. Now, since I suspect that some, if not many viewers, might know little or perhaps even nothing about CASP, I'll try to keep things as simple as I can while hopefully not simplifying or oversimplifying too much. So, what is CASP? CASP is a radically different way of understanding and studying political economy. The basic claim is twofold. First is that we should understand capitalism not as a mode of production and consumption as mainstream and Marxist political economists tend to do, but as a mode of power. And second, that capital itself is best seen not as means of production, but as a symbolic quantification of power. Now, these alternative emphases make our analysis, I believe, totally different from that of existing political economy, and I'll try to explain why. But before I do that, let's address the simple question, why emphasize power? And the answer is quite simple, which is power dominates capitalism. And let's just give a few examples, beginning with corporations. Today's business landscape is ruled by very large state-backed corporate coalitions. We call them dominant capital. And these coalitions are not only very big, but they tend to grow bigger over time. If you take the top 100 corporations in the United States and take the average firm in that group, the gross earnings of that firm will be 15,000 times bigger than the gross earnings of a typical average US corporations. Now, to put this number in context, we can go back to 1950 where this number was only 1,000. In other words, the relative power of US dominant capital has grown 15 times over the past 75 years. Or we can look at the other elephant in the room, the capitalist state or the government. Over the past half century, government direct spending on goods and services around the world has risen to something like 15, 16, 17% of GDP. And this is just direct spending. If you include transfers like unemployment, welfare payment, interest payments on the public debt, the numbers rise to something like 25, 30, or 35%. So government is huge. And that's just for starters. Most activities in society are regulated in one way or another by states. One form of regulation that I'm sure everyone listening has heard of is intellectual property rights. And it turns out that market capitalization of corporations around the world listed on the stock market is made up anywhere between 50 or 75% of it is due to intellectual property rights or other forms of intangible assets, which means that much of the power of those large corporations is power over states. And these are, of course, only the most obvious examples, but we can broaden the vista and consider the organized use of force, open violence, and the frequent occurrences of war, or we can consider the fact that advertisement and brainwashing and conditioning is rampant in capitalism, or the fact that a lot of people ignore that most people in the world are religious. Now, these forms of power are everywhere. They are exerted by states, by corporations, by churches, by criminal organizations, by militias, and they're prevalent domestically as well as internationally. Now, you may think, okay, you're right, power is everywhere. But isn't this something that political economists should deal with? Isn't it the responsibility given the title of the profession? They are political economists. And the answer is really yes and no. Most political economists do not deal with power at all. This is the position of liberal economics, which relies on neoclassical theories of perfectly competitive equilibrium. And in these theories, power comes in, if and when it comes in at all, only from the outside. It comes in as a distortion, a non-economic distortion of the pure theory. Now, there's, of course, a small minority of political economists, and yes, you have guessed right, these are mostly Marxist or people influenced by Marxism, who do acknowledge power. Uh, and they emphasize primarily the class relations of society and the necessity of state as aspects of power. But they keep these aspects of power in general external to the process that matters the most, and that is the accumulation of capital proper. And the question is why, I think. Why do political economists ignore power and why do they keep it external to accumulation when they do acknowledge it? And I think the answer is twofold. First, there's the historical baggage. Neoclassical economists and liberalism more generally glorify and rest on individual utility, whereas Marxists rely on productive labor. So in both cases, we already have something at the top, something that is emphasized. So if power is addressed, it can come only second because the first place is already occupied. But there is another reason that I think is more important, and it is analytical. And that reason is that once neoclassicists and Marxists allow power in, the theories immediately break down. So let's just review these two explanations a little bit more closely and begin with the historical baggage. The liberal worldview, which emphasizes the individual, sees history in some sense as an ongoing progression, a progression against greater and greater personal freedom. And in this vision, the economy becomes more competitive over time. States tend to become weaker, wars become less frequent, and utility and productivity become the main drivers of society. That's the kind of linear or more or less linear liberal view. The Marxist perspective on history, of course, is radically different. For the Marxist, history is a dialectical development of modes of production, in which we have, on the one hand, the changing forces of production, and these changes are clashing with the class conflict that is rooted in production on the other hand. So from this perspective, power plays a role, but it plays a role mostly as a derivative of production in general and of the labor process in particular. Now, I think that the modern concepts rather, of the individual and of labor are, of course, very important for understanding capitalism. But in our view, the CASP perspective, these concepts are too limited to build a broad theory of capitalism on. As we see it, the theory of capitalism should not simply deal with power. It has to begin with power, and it has to put power at its very center. That's our view. It seems to us that human history, if we go back all the way to the fourth or third millennium BCE and extend it all the way to the present, is a series of increasingly organized modes of power. And the most important, sorry, the most recent mode of power is capitalism. And when we think of capitalism in those terms, the conventional distinction that is usually made between economy, politics, culture, becomes seriously misleading. It's not only because these different realms of society are in fact deeply intertwined, but because all of them, as we see it, get discounted right into capital. So in some sense, they're part and parcel of capital itself. Now to the second reason, which, as I mentioned, I think is more important. And the question here is, why do political economists fear power? And the reason has to do with the nature of capitalism itself, I think. And to explain that, I need to backtrack a little bit. Capitalism is unlike any other social order in the following sense, I think. It is almost entirely quantified, and its quantification is universal. You see, capitalism is a system of commodities. It tries to quantify everything and everyone by giving them a price. And once objects and people are commodified and priced, they become comparable to every other commodified object or commodified person. In this sense, the commodity system, I would argue, is inherently universal. So to understand capitalism, we must first understand its universal quantification in terms of prices, which is why every political economy begins with and rests on a theory of value. We know that the neoclassicists have their utility theory of value, and Marxists build on a labor theory of value. Now, the concrete nature of these theories are, of course, very different from one another. But the underlying logic of those theories, the way they actually operate, is very much the same. And I'll try to explain how. First, in both theories, each commodity has a real quantity. In the neoclassical case, the real quantity is the utils that the commodity generates. And in the Marxist case, it's the socially necessary abstract labor, or SNULT, that the commodity takes to reproduce. Second, in both theories, these real quantities are universal and comparable. So, for instance, we might say that the snout of a tractor is twice as large as the snout of a passenger car, or that the util of a shirt is half that of a coat. And the third point is that in both theories, money prices of commodities are proportionate to the real quantities of those commodities. So the tractor's price will be, in this case, twice as big as that of a car, and the coat will cost twice as much as the shirt. Now, how do these real quantities map into money prices? And in both approaches, the answer turns out to be the same. Real quantities are mapped into prices through the competitive market forces of supply and demand. So in the final analysis, what we have is perfect competition forces powerless individual agents, whether we call them producers and consumers or workers and capitalists, to obey the underlying reality of commodities. So it is the competitive equilibrium of supply and demand that ensures that money prices of commodities are proportionate to their respective utils or respective snult, depending on which theory you prefer to follow. And here there is a big problem. A theory that relies on self-equilibrating perfect competition is invalidated by power. Once you bring in oligopolies and monopolies, once you allow government policy into the analysis, the organized use of force and violence, brainwashing, manipulation, organized crime, religion, etc. Once you do those things, the perfectly competitive mapping of utils and snult into money prices no longer works. And without a working theory of values, then you cannot really have a general theory of capitalism, we argue. And that's not the end of it. You see, it's not only that political economists cannot explain prices. In fact, they have nothing to explain prices with. Utils and snult, which are the real linchpins of neoclassical and Marxist political economies, are not some objective, measurable entities, and they're certainly not universal ones. In fact, they are no more than figments of our imagination. In practice, nobody has ever been able to observe and measure actual supply and demand curves, let alone their equilibrium. And more importantly, no one has ever managed to directly measure utils or snult. And why not? Because they are, at least we think, are impossible entities to start with. So how do political economists square the circle? How do they figure out what the real quantities of utils and snult are in order to explain prices? And the answer is really simple and embarrassing. They go in reverse. They impute utils and snult from observable prices. Now, this is important. Imputation per se is not the problem. Many scientific measurements are imputed. In fact, most scientific measurements are derivatives of other fundamental quantities. The problem is different. The problem is that political economists take the utils and snult, which they just imputed from prices, and then use those imputations to explain the very prices they imputed those values from. Forgive me for the complicated sentence. In other words, they offer a tautology. Instead of explaining prices with values, they explain prices with themselves. So let me summarize briefly before we get to CASP. Power is everywhere in capitalism, yet political economists either ignore it or keep it external to their theories. The exclusion happens partly because political economists have traditionally prioritized other drivers, primarily utility and productive labor. But more importantly, because both liberals and Marxists rely on competitive market forces to map the real quantities of commodities into prices, and this perfectly competitive mapping breaks down once you allow power into the picture. And finally, if we accept the logic of perfect competition, we can't use it because nobody, including none of the 93 economic Nobelists, has ever been able to objectively measure either utils or snot. So, how can CASP solve any of these dilemmas and problems? Well, commodities obviously have many different physical properties and they're associated with many different human emotions, but in our view, none of these characteristics and emotions yield a universal quantity, let alone a quantity with which we can explain prices. In our view, prices are anchored not in the commodities themselves, but in the power relations between their owners. And as it turns out, unlike commodities, relations of power have a quantitative universal dimension. According to CASP, in capitalism, the relative price of a commodity represents the organized power of the commodity owners relative to the organized power of other owners. So, for example, if the price of oil goes up, it means that owners of oil become more powerful relative to other owners. Or if the relative price of labor, in other words, the wage rate compared to the prices of other commodities, goes down, that means that workers are becoming less powerful relative to owners of those other commodities. Or if the differential market capitalization of pharmaceutical firms increases, if you are a pharmaceutical owner, that means your power goes up relative to those who do not own pharmaceutical firms. And the purpose of CASP research is to explore and substantiate such claims and to situate them in such a way that we can understand capitalism more broadly from the viewpoint of power. So, for instance, in CASP, Shimshon and I, as well as other CASP researchers, have tried to theorize and historicize and also empirically discover the power processes that cause the relative price of oil, along with the relative income of OPEC and the oil companies, to rise manyfold from the early 70s to 1980 and then oscillate in long historical swings. Or the power processes that made the relative wage rate in the rich countries stagnate since the 1980s, or the power processes that pushed US differential pharma prices and along with profits and capitalization higher since the 70s, or the power processes that allowed the global grain companies to inflate raw food prices and in so doing leverage world hunger for the differential gains. And there are many more examples that you might fish on our websites if you care to read more. Now, the theoretical framework that CASP uses for this purpose is radically different than the frameworks employed by mainstream and by Marxist political economists. And I'll try to explain in what way. The main difference has to do with our concept of capital. Political economists tend to think of capital as a real material technological entity. Usually, they conceive it as some sort of sum total of means of production. Now, by contrast, CASP takes the viewpoint of capitalists, and it says that as investors, capitalists don't give a hoot about material means of production as such. For them, capital is equal to one thing and one thing only, which is market capitalization. Now, again, you might ask, why is this difference so important? Isn't it true that market capitalization is, in the final analysis, just a consequence of the real capital stock? And the answer might surprise you, which is not at all. They're not at all related. They're totally different entities, in fact. And I'll give you a few reasons why I make this conclusion or draw this conclusion. First, the growth rates of these two magnitudes move not together, but inversely. That's the case in the United States, which we investigated, where the growth rate of the real capital stock measured in replacement cost moves not together, but inversely with the growth rate of US capital market capitalization over the past century. And this inverse relation means that real capital, which is the holy grail of economics, is completely irrelevant to capitalists. Now, if you drill a little deeper into the concepts of these two entities, you realize that real capital is backward looking. It depends on the reinvestment of past profits, whereas market capitalization, which is emphasized by capitalists as well as by CASP, is entirely forward-looking. It depends not on the bygone past, but on the expectations about the unknown future. And the third and final reason is that theoretically, the so-called real capital stock is anchored in a single magnitude. It's a simple aggregation, essentially, of invested or reinvested past profits. And market capitalization is a different creature. It depends on four different elements. It depends on the profits to be earned in the future. It depends on the optimism or pessimism of capitalists about those profits. It depends on their risk perceptions. And it depends on the normal rate of return with which they discount this amalgam of elements to their present value. Now, given these multiple differences, it's no wonder that the real capital stock, which political economists see as the beginning and end of capitalism, has nothing to do with market capitalization, which is the single sole god of capitalists. And now we get closer to the heart of the matter. According to CASP, market capitalization and its components are about power and only about power. So not only do we have a different concept of capital, but we argue that our concept is affected not by production, productivity, labor, utility, all those things, but by power and only power. In fact, we argue it represents power and only power. And the basis for this claim begins with a logical separation, which, as far as I know, was first offered by Thorstein Veblen between what he called industry and business. And he argued that these are not the same things at all. In his view, industry, which he used to denote the sum total of production and knowledge in society, is a collaborative societal process. This idea, which, mind you, was recognized, even if only in passing, by Karl Marx in the Grundrisse, becomes obvious these days. You just look at AI and you realize how quickly it harvests and mobilizes the entire corpus of human knowledge. Not yet, but it goes in that direction. Now, from this viewpoint, the common economic notion that there exists some sort of a production function, and I use it in the most general sense. In other words, a function that combines different factors of production, if we use the neoclassical lingo, or specific labor inputs, if we use the Marxist language, and that each of these elements has a distinct, identifiable contribution to the final output. In our view, this notion is not only impossible to concretize in practice, but it's essentially theoretically untenable. And it's untenable, we think, because when you consider industry in Veblen's totalizing sense, and when you consider it independently of business institutions, you can think about it in hologrammic terms. And hologram means the whole picture. And in a moment, I'll explain what it means. It suggests that every industrial activity whether it's physical or mental, whether it happened in the past or in the present, it spreads like a wave throughout the broad realm of industry. And this wave intersects all the other waves that are created by every other industrial activity. And these intersections generate some sort of a resonating totality because the purpose of industry requires collaboration. It requires a reasoned application of agreed upon logic and science and technology and so on. And this resonating totality, because of those infinite intersections, gets embedded in every product of industry. Now, this collaborative slash hologramic nature of integrated industry, namely the notion that every product and service contains a mirror of the entire collaborative effort of humanity, makes it really impossible to deduce distribution, which is differential, from production, which is totalizing and integrated. So, how is distribution determined? Well, the answer from a cost perspective is that distribution is a consequence not of the productive realm of industry, but of the pecuniary relations of power of business. The institution of business, Veblen argued, is totally different from that of industry as such. It certainly relates to industry, but the relation is not one of production, it's one of power and control. As a resonating totality, industry has no need for business, by definition. The only thing business can do standing outside of industry is either do nothing or undermine slash threaten to undermine industrial resonance. Now, of course, in the capitalist mode of power, business controls the direction and the level of operation of industry. And this control occurs not by amplifying industrial resonance and cooperation, but through different forms of dissonance and sabotage. And the notion of capital as power comes from this latter association between power and redistribution. Now, according to Kasp, the driving force of capitalism, just like the driving force of earlier modes of power, is not hedonic pleasure and it's not the amassment of more and more real means of production. Instead, it's power for the sake of power. So, power is the ultimate goal. And this goal, power for the sake of power, Kasp argues, manifests itself in two related ways. First, through the process of differential accumulation, and second, through the related institution of dominant capital. In the actual world of business, capitalists and firms are conditioned and compelled not to maximize profits or net worth, but to beat the average and exceed the normal rate of return. In other words, whether they know it or not, their aim is not absolute but relative. It's not absolute accumulation, but differential accumulation that they seek. And differential accumulation means raising one's capitalization relative to others. And that is done by increasing the basic components I mentioned before, or elementary particles of one's capitalization relative to those of others. So it's done by raising differential profits relative to others, by raising differential hype relative to others, and by reducing differential risk relative to others. And all of these increases and reductions are business activities, and they are achieved by business ends, not by industrial ends. Capitalists achieve them not by boosting production or by doing things with technology and labor and so on, but by undermining the productive process in various ways through forms of what we call strategic sabotage. So just a few examples of what Kasp research has examined along those lines. One example is the way in which the big oil companies since the 1960s have used Middle East energy conflicts to boost their differential oil prices, profits, and capitalization. And obviously, war is far removed from production. If anything, it's the most devastating form of sabotage. Or CASP research demonstrated how the large grain companies and other food companies engage both in hunger and obesity to boost differential prices, profits, and assets, or analyzing how the US leading pharmaceutical firms have actually created and transformed and established the nature of intellectual property rights and spread them around the world to become the world's most powerful group, most profitable group of corporations. Or how in Hollywood, the big film companies used the technology of blockbusters to decimate creativity in order to reduce differential risk and boost their differential assets, even though their earnings were not much to write home about. Another example is from a comparison between Israel and South Africa, where the leading conglomerates supported a war economy in Israel and apartheid in South Africa to boost their differential returns until it wasn't differentially profitable anymore and they went for reconciliation. And the final example, more recent one, is the buildup of dominant capital hierarchies and how they actually use much of the energy that is created in the world or harnessed in the world and threaten the ecological future of humanity. And again, there are many more examples that are available on our websites. Now, the ongoing processes of differential accumulation and the sabotage that they rely on gradually have given rise to a tight hierarchical cluster or clusters of leading corporations, all intimately tied with state organs and with each other, which we call dominant capital. And over the past century or so, all capitalist countries have become dominated by these increasingly global hierarchical networks of differential capitalized power. And these dominant capital networks are, at least in our opinion, the key agents of the capitalist mode of power. Now, over time, the processes of differential accumulation and the associated consolidation of dominant capital have fundamentally altered the very nature of capitalism. And this is important. And, I'm getting towards the end of my short presentation. Political economists, both mainstream, I think, and heterodox, claim that capitalism thrives on economic growth on the one hand and on price stability on the other, and that it falters under the opposite conditions, in other words, when there's stagnation and or inflation. Now, this view was born maybe in the early 19th century or even earlier, and it relies on the notion that capitalists seek absolute gain and therefore they invest in new capacity, and that the discipline of competition forces them to constantly cut costs and prices. Now, CASP, by contrast, was born in the late 20th century, so it's more than 2 centuries later, and it has revealed, I think, a totally different reality. It demonstrated first that capitalists, particularly dominant capital, seek not absolute but differential gain, and that the rise of dominant capital and differential accumulation has altered the modus operandi of capitalism. First, it shifted the focus from economic growth to corporate mergers and acquisitions. And we've seen that in the US and the UK very, very clearly. And second, it showed that rising concentration enabled dominant capital to orchestrate the use of power and sabotage, both among themselves and with governments, in such a way that help redistribute income and assets, not through competitive price cutting, but on the contrary, through differential inflation and, in fact, differential stagflation. And here I come to my last point, which I think will connect in some way the world of CASP with that of Michael Hudson and others, who have put a lot of emphasis on the power aspect of debt, credit, and money. I think it was Veblen who was probably the first to coin the term the larger use of credit. And what he meant by this term was that by the late 19th century and early 20th centuries, credit has become something much larger than simply a means of buying and selling goods and services. It became the main form of organizing ownership through the issuance and manipulation of forward-looking stocks and bonds. And from a cost perspective, this larger use of credit serves to mobilize the new modus operandi of the capitalist mode of power I spoke with, and it also links to, I think, to Michael's perspective. First, it made capital vendible, and making capital vendible enabled mergers and acquisition on a very large scale, and eventually enabled the rise of dominant capital. The second thing is that by giving capitalists the right to issue more and more shares and more debt instruments, it privatized essentially the creation of money beyond government and even beyond the financial institutions proper. And third and lastly, it made it both possible and more importantly necessary for dominant capital to orchestrate ongoing inflation in order to validate, to back essentially the capital, meaning stocks and bonds that they were issuing at an ever increasing rate. So they needed to inflate their prices in order to essentially, in business jargon, keep the PE ratio from rising and rising. And I'll end here. Thank you.
Great. Thanks very much, Jonathan. Obviously, quite a complex theory, especially for new initiates, but I think that was a wonderful explanation of the capital as power perspective. And I look forward to a fruitful conversation with Blair and Michael in just a moment after this short break. And now I'd like to invite Blair Fix to address some of the comments made by Jonathan Nitzan.
All right, thanks, Tim. Thanks, Jonathan. So I thought I would talk briefly about the role of theory as I see it in political economy. So stepping back a bit in the wider world of science, scientific progress depends crucially on this, an interplay between theory and empirical work. And theory can never go it alone. Whenever theorists try, they get lost in dark corners. And I think we're seeing this a little bit in physics right now with theoretical physics, where they've kind of exhausted what they can do with particle accelerators. And for the last 50 years, they're kind of just going where their minds take them. And it never, in my mind, it never goes well. And that kind of, I think, sadly summarizes much of the history of political economy. It's from the start was divorced from evidence and data. And to be fair to the early political economists like Adam Smith, there was no data. They were just, going out into the world and doing kind of anecdotal observations, and that's fine. But very quickly, theory got way ahead of evidence, and political economy from the outset was kind of a branch of what I would call armchair philosophy, where you start with the conclusions that you want to prove, and then you figure out a clever way to deduce them from some starting assumptions. And sadly, I think that's the whole history of the dominant schools in political economy. So starting with, Marx is first. So let's start with Marx. He wants to explain capitalist exploitation, which is a great starting point. And Marx, a historian, I love reading, but he quickly decided he was going to ground this in quote unquote scientific principles. And for him, that meant a theory of value. And this was then, the theory of value was not, let's go out in the world and, try to test some principles and come up with something empirical. It was an assumption right from the get-go. Labor produces all value. And then from there, you can say, well, if labor gets only a portion of the value that they produce, then we have exploitation and the whole mechanics of capital accumulation. But from the start, these are assumptions, hard, just philosophical assumptions. Same thing with neoclassical theory, but in the opposite direction, right? The early neoclassical economists were clearly on the side of capitalists, upper classes of society, and they wanted to maintain the present order of things. So John Bates Clark was explicit when he created his theory of marginal productivity, just explicit that he wanted to justify the status quo, because if workers, in his words, came to believe that they didn't get the value that they produced, they would have the right to rebellion. Now I'm paraphrasing a bit, but that was explicit in the beginning of his work, in which he outlined the theory of marginal productivity. So what did he do? He basically came up with a different set of assumptions, starting points where you can then derive or prove that the distribution of income is just, is proportional. Everybody earns in proportion to what they produce, both capitalists and laborers. So this is straight up just moral philosophy. Start with some assumptions and prove what you want to prove. And this, has been very effective as an ideological tool, incredibly effective. If you learn economics in a modern university, you're going to learn neoclassical economics. If for some reason you avoid that fate and you study maybe sociology, but economic sociology, you're going to learn Marxism. And this, I think, is a tragedy for empirical science, which is what I'm interested in, and what Jonathan and Shimshon's work has been so liberating, because to do good empirical science, you need to be free to ask questions. And the sad part in my mind about neoclassical economics and Marxist economics is mostly what they do is take questions off the table. Just say, there's no point in asking those questions because we know the answer. So a good example in Marxist theory is the stock market. Marxists, when they talk about the stock market, will frequently just dismiss it and call it fictitious capital, because it's not rooted in real production. It's financial capital. And I think that you can see where they get there from their theory, but it's a huge mistake, because if you knew nothing about the world and just came and observed the way people behave in the 21st century, watching stock tickers go by, obsessing about it, and the fact that businesses are obsessed with capitalization, it seems insane to say that's fictitious. It is clearly important, and we'll get to the reasons why in a second. But so Marxists take that off the table and say, there's really nothing to say about the stock market. You're wasting your time if you dive into it, because we're talking about fictitious capital. Why would you research something that's fictitious? And likewise with neoclassical economics, they take the stock market off the table, but somewhat differently. Basically, there's an anecdote from the CEO of General Motors. I think it was in the 60s or the 50s, was going to work in the U.S. government in a high post. And he was questioned by the Senate, and he said, well, I thought he was questioned about conflicts of interest. And his response, well, isn't what's good for General Motors good for America? And that's kind of neoclassical economics in a nutshell. When you look at the stock market, they see that it ultimately has to be rooted in production, and production is rooted in giving consumers utility. So if stocks go up, that has to be in some sense an indicator that the wider economy is getting better. And you still see this in the financial press, where liberals especially just celebrate that stocks are going up as if it's good for everybody, and not just the people who own those stocks, not the vast majority of people who earn a wage. And so for me, as a young researcher, what was just completely liberating is to have these false, in my mind, answers taken off the table. And suddenly you're free to research a whole new set of ideas. And I think as soon as you see the world in terms of power, it gives you a whole new dimension of analysis. So back to the stock market, I was very confused in grad school. As soon as I started reading about economics, like, what is the stock market? What does it mean when stocks go up? And so you have the standard answers from neoclassical economics and then the more subversive ones from Marx. But when I started learning about capital as power, there's a whole new answer or hypothesis which is that this is about differential power. So a very concrete indicator. What if you take stock prices, say, of the S&P 500 and index them against average wages? And so this is something that Jonathan Nitzan and Shimshon Bichler did. They called this the power index. And it oscillates up and down, up and down. And we're at a high point. And this, I think, is a fascinating use of data that's there for everybody, but nobody really thought to do this because they usually don't think of the stock market in terms of power. And when you do this, it's shocking, right? Because we're at a high point. There's if you take the US S&P 500 index against wages, average American wages, that index has never been higher. I mean, the stock market is just off the charts, whereas normal workers are suffering. And to just wrap up with some to ground this in kind of what's happening right now is, Trump won the election and Democrats are just utterly, well, liberal Democrats are utterly confused about what went wrong because they've got so many indicators. Look, the economy is doing great. But the economy is doing great for some people, namely the wealthy, and that stocks are going up. Great. If you earn the majority of your income from earning stocks, life is good. If you're working for a wage, life is not good. And so this kind of stepping back and looking at the world in a different way for me has been super important. And capital as power, in my mind, what's most important about it is not the answers that it gives, although I think it does give some good answers, but the questions that it backs up and puts on the table and the kind of wrong answers, in my mind, that it takes off the table. And that's super important because a big part of the mental block that Jonathan alluded to in political economy is false answers. So, this is attributed to Mark Twain, but how does it go? It's not what you know that gets you into trouble. It's what you think you know that just ain't so, right? That's the problem in political economy in a nutshell, is that people have things that they hold to be true that I now believe are not true. And once you take them off the table, then you're free to do, I think, much more interesting research. But then I'm biased about that. But I think I'll leave it there. But that's my main point.
Thanks, Blair. That's absolutely excellent. Some very, very prominent points and certainly nice summary and critique of existing political economy. Now, I'd like to introduce Michael Hudson. I think the point of contact here, Michael, between the Capital as Power research agenda and your own work is obviously the concept of power redistribution and inequality. But Michael's work is arguably been more historical about these power hierarchies, redistribution, and certainly around the concepts of money, finance, and debt. So, Michael, I'd like to invite you to respond to the Capital as Power tradition or to speak about your own work and how you conceive of power. The floor is yours.
Well, I want to talk about Jonathan's work because we're on a parallel track. But I use a different vocabulary. And as you pointed out, I talk in historical terms. I used to be an economist, but then, as Jonathan explained, I couldn't fit what the reality I was dealing with into the academic curriculum. So I left to be a futurist in the 1970s. And then I found that the problems of debt and exploitation and the things that Jonathan described as power were so fundamental that I went from being a futurist to become an archaeologist and anthropologist for 25 years at Harvard. So I want to give, I want to give a long explanation of how I come to what is a convergence of my ideas with Jonathan's, but using a different vocabulary, largely Marxist and even more classical political economy that Marx dealt with in volumes 2 and 3 that tends not to be looked at by Marxists, but I think explains a lot of what is called fictitious capital and what to me is simply the capitalization of economic rent, which Jonathan would call the capitalization of power. That sort of is the umbrella approach to us. Now, I'd read in the past, maybe 20 years ago, it seems, articles by Bickler and Nitzan about power, but it seemed to be talking in the general too much, not the specific. And I was very specific and empirically minded, for better or worse. And Pettifor, I think 20 years ago, maybe it's 25 years ago, asked me to write an article on the rise to power of finance. And I wasn't able to write it. So she published something from my super imperialism instead. But then later, when I wrote my book on modern economics, Killing the Host, I had a whole chapter on the rise of the financial sector to power. So I began to realize that, yes, what we're talking about is not simply an economic category of rent. We're talking about power. And I begin to say, well, what really is power? It's a free lunch. It's getting power over others. It's getting something without working for it, but getting other people to work. And I was writing about power from the point of view of what is it used for? Obviously, it's for the control of assets and income and other people's labor. Is it used for good or worse? Well, most societies since the Stone Age and the indigenous communities that anthropology has looked at is that almost all low surplus economies have sanctions against people who try to acquire power because it's divisive. Power is achieved by some people by injuring other people, by forcing them into debt, by forcing them into bondage to pay off the debts, and ultimately taking their land as a means of support. That's creditor power and you see it through ancient history. Well, why isn't this recognized by economists, as he points out? And it's treated indeed, as Jonathan points out, as something external, not as the key element of what the economy is all about. And a large part of that explanation, I think, is that this acquisition of power involves a kind of ideological counter-revolution against classical economics. Power wants to make itself invisible. It wants people to think that power is really all used for the benefit of everybody, that selfishness is good, and that it helps the economy grow. And as Jonathan wrote, this point 5.3, once your power into the value theories of neoclassical economics and Marxism, their entire edifice breaks down. Well, I would agree with that statement, simply replacing it with his word power with the concept of economic rent. Once you introduce rent, the whole idea of everything in value breaks down. I'm sorry he used the word labor theory of value. Well, of course, that's what Marx used to count value. But the classical discussion of value theory from the physiocrats through Adam Smith, through Ricardo, John Stuart Mill to Marx was basically a theory of economic rent. Why did they want to discuss value? In order to explain the difference between price and value. How do you explain prices in excess of value? The answer is, by definition, economic rent is the excess of market price over value. It's not fictitious capital. It's not fictitious income. You could call it power income. if you wanted, because it's unearned and therefore looked down upon, certainly by the logic of early industrial capitalism that deplored the idea of unnecessary costs, Marx's faux frais of production. The whole idea was to get rid of unnecessary costs, to cut them, and to get rid of the power of the landlord class inherited from feudalism, because that they collected rent in their sleep without working. Well, that's power, being able to get rent in your sleep and being able to use the rents that you got to control governments. Also inherited from feudalism were the monopolies that bankers created in order to help kings and later parliamentary democracies extract revenue to pay interest on their war debts. Banking arose to make war loans from the 13th century, sponsored by the Christian church, leading to the church to reject Christianity's original arguments against usury, all the way down through really the 20th century. Banking was based on war debts or on increasingly on rent seeking. Once you got rid of the landlord class, you didn't get rid of economic rent. Real estate was privatized. Anybody could buy a home or an office building. You just had to pay the rent to the banks. So by the 20th century, bankers became the counterparts to the landlords that the classical economists talk about. Marx discussed all of this in volume 2 and especially in volume 3. Very few Marxists talk about volumes 2 and volume 3, which is why I haven't had much to do with Marxist groups for the last half century, although I work very closely with Marxists who do read volume 3. So let me summarize my point as a classical economists. They developed their value theory to isolate economic rent as something that should be got rid of, that had been achieved by power, indeed, from outside the economy, as economists talk about it, but it was always something external. Marx is very clear. He divided the economy into the sphere of production and the sphere of circulation. That's very much like what Veblen ended up talking about, the difference between industry and business. That is exactly what today's economic orthodoxy doesn't recognize. You could state it another way. You could say the wealthiest 10% of the population are creditors holding the rest of the population in debt. If you look at the great polarizing force of inequality, that's debt leverage. That's how Rome's creditor oligarchy ended up reducing the economy to bondage. And it's how today's rentier class is imposing a post-industrial society, imposing austerity in order to force economies to pay off the debt. So beginning in the 1980s, I wanted to see, how did all this begin? How did debt and absentee land ownership begin? It couldn't have been that debt began with the intention of people getting together and say, how can we impoverish society and get power over it? How did it begin in archaic communities, which couldn't afford power-driven individuals, because most power was achieved by exploiting other people, by lending to them or by force in some cases. And archaic tribes organized their economy basically through gift exchange. Everybody owed food and other to each other, but it was all in balance. And you could say power enters the equation at the point where it begins to unbalance society, to interject itself into the social balance that's designed to hold people together in a positive relationship, into something that becomes more and more predatory and corrosive and destructive. by distorting the balance and polarizing. So the aim of seeking power was to get either interest or economic rent, as the classical economists defined it, something for nothing, the free lunch. You have Milton Friedman saying there's no such thing as a free lunch. That's the whole problem with academic economics. The economy is all about a free lunch. And that free lunch is what Jonathan calls power. Basically, that's the sort of convergence between my approach and him. The aim of individuals seeking power was to make other people to think it's not power at all. I'm helping you, and people at first did try to get wealth and more than others. But if you look at really indigenous communities, such as the German historian looked at in the late 19th century, you would have individuals trying to get rare foreign objects or hand-me-downs that were the inheritance clothes or goods of leading families. Heinrich Schurz wrote The Origins of Money in German in 1898, describing this. But this kind of wealth wasn't really monetary. It wasn't involved with other people's debt. Other people would, for a long time, they would either donate their wealth to society and get a claim for being a gift giver, or like John D. Rockefeller, a philanthropist. Or if they did get wealth, societies would bury it with them. They didn't want the wealth that was acquired by a few power-driven individuals to be bequeathed to their ancestors to create a family dynasty, which would have lorded it over the rest of society. So there were all sorts of personal tendencies to power that were opposed by social sanctions. And you find that in low surplus communities, or in communities like Australia, where they say a nail that stands up will get pounded down. It's considered antisocial to have that power, and that's another element of power that's key. It's antisocial behavior as well as it's exploitative economic behavior. So how did this power actually develop? It developed partly by evading or disabling public restrictions on power, such as in Babylonia, in the Bronze Age, Sumer in Babylonia, the rulers were in charge of preventing what they would call economic disorder. They knew that debts at interest tended to compound and grow beyond the ability of the population to pay. If there was a flood, the laws of Hammurabi would cancel the debts that were owed by cultivators. If there was a drought, same thing. There was a war, the same thing. And just in general, every new ruler of the Sumerian, Babylonian dynasty would cancel the debts upon their coronation, which usually was their the second full year on the throne. So the whole idea was to prevent a creditor, landowning, rent-seeking, power-driven oligarchy from developing, because they perceived that an oligarchy would try to get rid of the ruler, get rid of the ruler as sort of reflecting the divine religion of keeping economic order. This is a very Asiatic idea, unlike that of Western civilization. And they wanted to replace it with an absence of any overarching social or political or royal power. Well, where this power developed was not really in Asia. It was in the West, in Greece and Rome. And it developed there because there was a dark age from about bad weather from about 1200 BC to the 8th century. gradually you had Syrian and Phoenician merchants and traders come to Greece, come to Rome, comes throughout the Mediterranean, and they spread the idea of interest-bearing debt, of charging interest. That had been completely absent from the Bronze Age Greece and West. No sign of it in the linear B tablets of Mycenaean Greece. So you had Greece and Rome grow without any central power. Modern economics would call that autocracy, but what modern days call autocracy is the preservation of relative equality and the prevention of predatory power centers. So wealth began to be obtained in various ways in antiquity through military conquest, insider dealing, bribery, and from taking public property into private hands. That's really what happened throughout the Roman Republic, privatization, just like it did under Margaret Thatcher's England or Ronald Reagan's the United States. So I think the big question to me, sort of prior to the discussion of power that Jonathan had, is how did power institutionalize itself? Force obviously is needed at some point to prevent resistance, but otherwise, if it was just force, there would be revolts and walkouts like occurred in Italy. You have to get, you need an ideological dimension of power that denies that power exists. The very first point that Jonathan made regarding the academic curriculum. You need a political system or ideology needed to give the illusion that the powerful people are really part of this common mutual aid society, just helping it grow faster. Nothing about power there. They call it just their contribution. Or wealth seeking, the whole concept of wealth had developed that ambiguity between wealth in the financial predatory sense of capitalizing rent seeking, of which intellectual property is a subdivision, or wealth in the form of actual means of production. So in that sense, power was consolidated by making other people dependent on you and ultimately on a power-driven class, on an oligarchy that claims not to exist as an oligarchy, and to sanctify itself, and by doing so, transforming the whole character of archaic religion, which is based on balance and treating the mercantile class and the creditor class is the bottom of the social register, not at the very top as it is today. So land rent and other forms of economic rent are the result of how depicted as a result of how a free market works, as if it's the result of choice, as if people choose to pay rent. After all, doesn't the renter sign a lease? And if you have to borrow money from a bank to break even, don't you sign an IOU? So it seems to be all voluntary. Whereas real power is to create a system that isn't voluntary at all, that forces dependency on the part of its victims. Debtors will sign the contract. Well, you had the whole origins of Christianity, being Jesus going to the synagogue, unrolling the scroll of Isaiah, talking about the year of the Lord, meaning the Jubilee year, canceling the debts, and said that that was what he had come to proclaim. And there was a large movement already on that in Israel. And it was fought against by the Pharisees and by the rabbinical class that supported the creditors instead of the debtors. So you could look at here in early Judaism, you had the same fight that was occurring through all of antiquity between the creditor and the debtor class. And I think that is if you're going to talk about power, you might as well talk about who has the most power and how is it applied. And that's the creditor class. And you could call it the rentier class because creditors use their power to first and foremost take control of the land, of the basic means of support, the subsoil wealth, and any kind of rent yielding asset, which meant an asset that enabled you to get income in your sleep without working, actually having to work for it. And you can see the traditional social morality expressed over 5,000 years of written records show that societies through the ages believed that their ethic was to prevent that kind of power. And what became evil and what was viewed as evil was the drive to confuse the population into passively permitting the financial sector and its rent-seeking clients to abolish public authority, to create its own money, create its own laws, to sanctify the appropriation of property from the community to themselves, and essentially to call the rulers who were protecting the indebted population as a whole of being what President Biden calls autocracy, and to pretend that the creditor class, the exploiters, were what President Biden calls democracy, when actually it was just exactly the opposite. They were, of course, not a democracy, but an oligarchy. So the effect on you could look at this in terms of the government budget. The first thing that once you get some power, enough to challenge the government and take it over, you then begin to privatize what is in the public domain, what was created by other people, transferring it to yourself. And under the slogan of free markets, you say that government activity and regulation to protect debtors, to protect homeowners, to protect consumers from monopoly is interference with a free market. Well, that's the opposite of what a free market was for Adam Smith and John Stuart Mill and all of the classical economists. For them, a market was free of economic rent, free from the legacy of feudalism, of rentiers, free from a hereditary landlord class, free from the monopolies that were inherited from the banks, and free from a banking system that basically was predatory. The whole idea that what Marx expected was for industrial capitalism to evolve into socialism, and the role of industrial capitalism was to industrialize banking. Well, what the last two talks today have shown is that instead, industry was financialized instead of industrializing industry. Just the opposite. You've had the dynamics of rentier income, or the capitalization of power, into deindustrializing the economies of the United States and Europe. So without using the word power as such, what I was describing was what it actually was. But instead of using the general term power, I wanted to be very specific and focus on the term economic rent as distinguished from value, as the unearned element, or as was just described, the capitalization of corporate wealth over and above the actual value, cost value, book value of the tangible wealth, the socially necessary labor costs, ultimately necessary to create the means of production. That you've had a financialization of the economy, which is basically, you could trace this ethic all the way back 2,000 years to the beginning of Western civilization. And you could say that the whole fight of the global majority today, the BRICS countries, to break away from the US, NATO, West, is a return to this Asiatic concept of a a society that minimizes predatory power by devoting itself to the actual increase in material wealth. Well, that's what the American School of Political Economy did in the 19th century. America's rise to industrial power was characterized by rising wages, not direct exploitation in principle. Individual companies, of course, would try to minimize and break the strikes of their labor force. But generally, the whole philosophy of industrial capitalism in the United States and in Germany was the economy of high wages, the realization that high wage, well clothed, well fed, well housed labor was more productive than pauper labor. And if you weren't going to raise the wages, the money wages, how could you actually raise the living standards? Well, the solution was to have the government provide more and more of the basic needs of the population, to provide free education, healthcare, and to provide public utility, public infrastructure at a subsidized rate, like the Erie Canal, the whole the transportation system, the postal system, the communication system was to be essentially to enable the economy to work at a low cost basis so that it could undersell rival economies. To Marx, that's what industrial capitalism was all about, trying to undersell rivals. And the way to do it was essentially to have government playing a larger and larger role, not only as a capital investor in infrastructure, but to regulate the economy, to tax away economic rent. So there wouldn't be any rent to support an idle landlord class, to prevent monopolies in private hands that simply would have raised the cost of living and doing business for most of the society. That's where capitalism seemed to be going. And it was going in that direction in the United States and in Germany. And World War I basically changed everything. You had an evolution from industrial capitalism into finance capitalism, and from industrial capital into finance capital. And essentially, you had a shift from the creation of value into the creation of economic rent. And that shift from creating cost value to rent as an unearned exploitative revenue was, I think, what Jonathan has been describing as power.
Thank you very much for those insights, Michael. Very engaging. Would we like to take a break for a couple minutes before maybe Jonathan and Blair respond? Yeah. All right. Let's take 3 minutes, guys, and I'll pause the recording here, and we'll come back in 3 minutes. So we're back with Professor Jonathan Nitzan, Professor Michael Hudson, and Blair Fix. We've just heard from Michael Hudson on a number of topics which has to do with the monetization, privatization of society, which requires dispossession, the rise of property rights, and what we haven't really discussed so much is the rise of ownership and the protection of ownership. As Michael Hudson has suggested, the capital is power theory uses a different vocabulary than the critical perspective of Michael Hudson, but there are obviously very big points of contact. I'd like to invite now Jonathan to address some of the topics and themes that were discussed by Professor Hudson.
Thank you, Tim. Maybe Blair wants to say something. I mean, I have comments to make following Michael, but as I suggest, maybe I defer to Blair if he has something to say now.
You can go ahead, I think, Jonathan.
Yeah, okay. So I'd like to focus on capitalism specifically because you, Michael, broadened the vista considerably going back all the way to the Bronze Age. And I don't think that I know enough to, off the top of my head, engage about this subject. Uh, but I think that more pertinent is the question of how we conceptualize capitalism and whether, in fact, there is a parallel or is a bigger parallel, as you suggest, between our approaches. So I think your argument can be boiled down to the claim that if we instead of using the term power, we speak about rent, then our approaches will look very much like one another, not exactly the same, but very similar. And I'm not sure that this is true. And the reason I think we don't emphasize rent is not semantic, it's theoretical. The key issue here, I think, is the concept of productivity and how it relates to the distribution of income. And until capitalism, there was really very little growth to speak of, and distribution was largely zero sum. And income was usually understood as being determined by the gods and backed by force. But when production started to grow, maybe in the 18th century or so, and conservation laws replaced the church gradually, the distribution of income shifted from the will of the gods to productivity. And the key question over which everyone bickered was which class was most productive. And this is a subject you probably know about as much as I do, and probably much more. Uh, the physiocrats were the first who spoke for the nobility, and they claimed that productivity came from the land, and then the classical political economists represented the bourgeoisie, so they argued that productivity was anchored in industry, and Marx said, hold on, it's just the working class, and he insisted that all productivity can be traced back to industrial laborers, and then came the neoclassicists who turned out to speak for dominant capital that started to emerge in the time. And they claim that the most productive agents are those that earn the most, so in a circular way. Now, I think that yourself and other heterodox theorists, not too many, but some, in some sense continue this line of thinking when you divide, and here you can correct me after if I'm wrong, you divide capital essentially into two types, good and bad, or at least this is the way it can be interpreted and has been interpreted. So good capital is real means of production, which essentially push for technical change, and they generate growth because this is how they thrive. And bad capital is finance, or more generally, rentier capital, which you and other consider to be unproductive and parasitic. And finance and rentiers more generally are seeking to confiscate, in this view, as much surplus as possible, even if they end up suffocating and killing the host on which they latch. And I think this is the title of one of your books. Now, our own view on the subject, which we explained in many of our books and articles, is rather different, I think. First, in our perspective, productivity isn't something that anyone can observe and measure, and let alone assign. Even if we know, and even if we can observe all the inputs and the outputs of production, the process by which the inputs create the output is, in fact, within a black box. We don't know what happens inside the box. We theorize, we claim that X determines Y in certain quantities, but this is an outside determination. It's not an inside determination, and that's why the debates are so unresolved. And that's not the end of it, because in today's complex world, we often don't know all the inputs and outputs of production because production has become so complex. And if we cannot measure productivity objectively, it's very hard to explain distribution with something we cannot measure. So what do we do? And this is why I kind of try to explain that, because I think this point, even if you don't mean it in exactly those terms, could be misleading the people who don't get exactly your intention. We in Capital as Power bypass the problem completely. First, as I mentioned in my presentation, we see production as a totalizing collaborative process. So it's attributed not to separate and individual factors of production, individual agents, individual corporations, but to the process as a whole. And this entire collaboration gradually gets embedded in every product of industry. That's why we call it hologramic, which means that every product contains the whole picture of industry. And the second point is that we argue that capital, all of it, is external to the hologramic definition of industry. So in its abstract form, capital for us is simply market value. It's finance and only finance. So there is no such thing as industrial versus financial capital. If we look at the capital of JP Morgan Chase or Allianz, which is the largest insurance company, or Apple, or Toyota, or Lockheed Martin, or Pfizer, or ExxonMobil, all of these are giants that are busy doing different things, presumably. But their capital is all the same. In each and every case, it represents the capitalization of risk-adjusted expected future earnings. And that's it. So in this context, there is no distinction between productive capitalists and financial capitalists and rentier, I think. Today, most owners, whether they are big or small, private or institutional, are totally absent from production. And usually they know not the first thing about it. They just own claims on pecuniary earnings, regardless of whether those earnings come from. And I think the same goes for corporation. In our view, there are no productive as opposed to unproductive corporations. It's true that in everyday language, different corporations are associated with different activities. But this linguistic separation, I don't think makes GM and Pfizer productive and JP Morgan and Allianz unproductive and parasitic. I think corporations are not industrial entities, full stop. They're just legal entities, and as legal entities, they do not engage in production. They simply control it. They direct it. And as we see it, consequently, corporations stand outside of industry proper, and the only way for them to exact earnings, as I suggested earlier, and I just want to repeat it for people who are not familiar with CASP, the only way to exact earnings and reduce their risk is by either doing nothing or by sabotaging and threatening to sabotage industry in general. And here is the key point. This sabotage of industry by business is exercised not only by so-called fire corporations. It's exercised by every successful corporation, I think, and it has to be exercised by every successful corporation, whether we classify it as manufacturing or service or utilities, or if we classify it as banking or insurance or real estate. From our perspective, this business sabotage is everywhere. It's embedded in the processes of mergers and acquisitions, in the processes of stagflation, in planned product obsolescence, in intellectual property rights that control so much of what goes on, in institutionalized violence, in environmental destruction, imperialism, war, in economic policies or the lack of economic policies, in differential taxation and contracts, in political manipulation and brainwashing. I mean, I can go on and on. Now, if I understand you correctly, your notion of killing the host suggests that eventually this sabotage, whether it's exercised only by rentiers or by capital in general, as we claim, will decimate capitalism. So I'm extending your argument more generally. And I think that this claim is certainly possible. And I'm very much personally apprehensive about this actually happening. So it's not just decimating capitalism, but decimating capitalism and decimating our world with it. So this is a very real possibility, I think. But I think that there is another possibility, and that is that capitalism suffocates industry not completely, and it doesn't seek to suffocate it completely, and it actually makes an effort not to do so. It does so strategically. I think we have shown that empirically in many ways in our work over the past century, capital has gravitated toward what Veblen nicknamed very usefully at the turn of the 20th century as business as usual. So capital is seeking the right amount of sabotage needed to beat the average and exceed the normal rate of return. And if that is true, in other words, if this experience of the 20th century tells us anything, is that the long-term trajectory of capitalism isn't preset. So it's not at all certain, excuse me, that this type of suffocation of the host will end to massive destruction.
Thank you, Jonathan.
Just let me a final sentence.
Of course.
So essentially, the long-term trajectory is dependent very much on the balance, not between productive and financial capital, I think, but by the broader balance within dominant capital, the struggles within dominant capital. And when I say dominant capital, I mean essentially the large corporations, but also the large government organs they are intertwined with, and between dominant capital and the underlying population. And the outcome is not written in the card, at least not theoretically. So I'll stop here. Thanks.
I think that's a very good point, Jonathan. I do want to get to that because the theme for this conversation is capital as power in the 21st century. And we've talked a lot about the past of power, the rise of hierarchies, and if Michael would allow us the rise of the capitalist mode of power rather than the capitalist mode of production. But I want to give the floor to Michael to respond to your comments, Jonathan, and then maybe we can have a think about how, and I know this is difficult to think about, but there are a lot of Marxists, especially in the literature, proclaiming, and they have proclaimed the death of neoliberalism, the death of capitalism, and what is the end point of this mode of power? And obviously, this will be highly speculative, but based on maybe a trajectory and some empirical evidence, and maybe Blair can speak to this as well when we get back to it. But Michael, the floor is yours.
Well, I can't disagree with anything that Jonathan has just said. Our narratives are identical, although we talk in a different way. Just as a house is worth whatever a bank will lend against it, you can say that all capital, which is incorporated in corporations, is worth whatever a bank will lend against it. So in that sense, you could say that all capital has become finance capital. I can go along with that. It's regarding productivity. Think of what Lloyd Blankfein of Goldman Sachs said. He said, our employees are the most productive people in America because they make the highest income. This is exactly what the gross domestic product accounts say. I agree with Jonathan that getting into the nitty-gritty of trying to go through any given corporation or the details becomes a statistical swamp. What I would avoid, I would abstract that whole process by looking at GDP. Suppose you were to take GDP less the fire sector. Well, then you'd have a closer approximation of what the productive economy is. And if you could estimate how much a monopoly rent is for all of this, you'd have an even closer approximation. So I can describe in theory and categories what things are without spending the rest of my life as an economic statistician trying to spell it all out. In that sense, again, I agree with them. Uh, what is the reality of GDP? Is the GDP of I think Foreign Secretary Lavrov of Russia said, well, look at how much larger the GDP of the BRICS countries are compared to the group of seven. Well, and he said, not only is it larger than the US and NATO, but it's the GDP for China means much more than it does in the United States because it doesn't incorporate all of this financialization and rent seeking. He didn't spell out financialization. He just said there's much more production oriented. It's something as a generality that one can understand on the surface of it. So this suppose I were advising the BRICS countries, how are you going to avoid the kind of power relations that you have in the West? That's where I can discuss the economics of power in the sense of what is it that you want to avoid? And I think that's what the classical political economists from Adam Smith, John Stuart Mill, and Marx on were saying. We want to get rid of rent seeking, the landlord class, the monopoly class, and the predatory banking class. You know what you want to get rid of. It's easier to say that than trying to actually describe productivity. But I would assume that we're on the same path there too. As I said, our narratives are similar. I'm trying to push it ahead is where do we go from here?
Very good question, Michael. I'd like to invite Blair to make any further comments related to either Jonathan or Michael's comments.
Well, what immediately pops into my mind. So first of all, I agree with Jonathan that just in a scientific sense, the idea of rent is very difficult to work with. It's great morally. We all have ideas about what type of activity should earn income and what should not. And there's nothing wrong with having those kind of morals. As a scientist, though, it becomes very difficult to work with, to start dividing activities into productive and unproductive. So I just don't do it. And I think that's what the CASP research has decided to do. We just don't do it. We look at differential income. And you can argue then that differential income is earned on dubious means, for instance, war. You can then appeal to morals, but you don't need the morals to begin with. But just kind of an example of sabotage that just is very clear, jumps out of the data, right, is the whole U.S. healthcare system. You can look at what you get out of healthcare, which in broad terms, very generally is life expectancy, and what you spend on it. And so if you look at rich countries, Canada, Britain, Japan, and look at how much they spend on healthcare and the life expectancy they get for it, and you contrast that with the US, which has a for-profit privatized system, the US is just an extreme outlier. And I think that is worthy of the word sabotage, because this is or a parasite, right? The pharmaceutical private healthcare system is a parasite that is delivering some healthcare, but is extracting a huge amount of profit for that. And we can use moral language for that, but the data, in this case, speaks for itself. So I think that's just a great example of it. You want to add anything, Tim?
No, obviously that's empirically verifiable and true. And I think, the theme of this conversation isn't necessarily sabotage, and I don't know how Michael thinks about it, but, you say you use a different vocabulary and you do. But what you see almost is sabotage as well in the Veblennian sense, right? The creation of private property rights, ownership, and then that implies and this goes back to Jonathan and other people's work, like exclusion, right? So part of power in the way that we can conceive it is to create exclusion, right? Because if everyone's included, as you were talking about earlier, societies where the function of the economy is embedded in society, and it's basically reciprocity, or at least insofar as we know, it's based on reciprocity and redistribution, right? Not on a power hierarchy and some trying to gain more than others. And if you did that, generally you're ostracized, penalized, or various ways of earlier tribal societies or indigenous societies, if you like, to deal with that. So that's my 2 cents on that. Over to you, Michael, if you have some comments about how you think of sabotage, ownership, private property, redistribution. I think it's pretty clear from your work, but if you'd like to add anything, please do.
I agree with that, Jonathan's description and Veblen's description. Yes, finance has sabotaged industrial capitalism into the kind of society that he's just describing. I think that's a wonderful word. Veblen often has a sarcastic word that he puts in. I mean, that's exactly what's happened and what I thought I was describing.
Great. Jonathan, over to you.
No, I think I'm good. I think maybe we have used effectively 2 hours.
Okay, excellent. Do we want to conclude here, or would we like to take a couple minutes break and talk about how we think of the future, or is that something for maybe another conversation? I'll leave it to the floor.
Well, I have a few more thoughts.
Okay.
Okay,
But
so let's
I've
return
got
in.
time. It's 8 a.m. here in Sydney, Australia.
yeah,
Looks like it's
I
going
have
to
maybe
be.
half an hour until I have to leave. So
Okay. Well, Michael, how are you for time?
I'll discuss whatever anybody brings up. We are going to transcribe all of this, aren't we?
I can see if I can do it. There's probably some
I
AI
thought you'd agreed.
technology
That was
that.
part of our agreement that you were
Oh,
going
that's
to,
right.
somebody
Okay.
was
yeah,
going to
there's
transcribe.
definitely some AI tools that could help you along, Tim.
I'm,
I'll figure it out. Don't worry about
It,
it,
it
Michael.
it it probably will get you a first draft, and then you have to go through it and clean it.
hmm
yeah, get a
hmm
draft. Yeah, a first draft. I will give it to my editor to clean up.
Okay, sounds excellent. Okay, Blair. So let's just do final thoughts. So everyone will have, say, 4 to 5 minutes, and then we'll conclude. So Blair, final thoughts.
Hmm. Well, maybe I'll speak a little bit about my own research that is influenced by capital as power, and that's on the topic of hierarchy. So, as Michael mentioned, a lot of early human societies actively stopped hierarchy from forming. Um, Christopher Bohm called it reverse dominance. And you can find similar sort of things where the culture of the society is stopping strong men from forming, from taking power and that kind of thing. And that persists for a long time, kind of until early agriculture. And then you start to get hierarchies. And the interesting thing about these early hierarchies is that they were incredibly despotic, like just clearly about, um, you know, endowing the rulers with tremendous power, divine right of kings, and that persists for thousands of years. And then when we get to capitalism, something different happens, which is that you have this explosion of hierarchy, and this is empirically true. The size of companies, firms just explodes during capitalism during the 18th and 19th century, and these are hierarchical institutions. So you have, on the one hand, an explosion in hierarchy in throughout capitalism, but a very different means of controlling them. So instead of inherited wealth and a landed aristocracy, people are buying and selling companies, and that's how you basically come to be at the top of a hierarchy. Is you buy it. And this is very different, much more dynamic, and I think early on, a much less despotic. So this is one of my hypotheses, is that there's this interplay between more hierarchy in the sense of large companies control, like Walmart, say, with millions of employees. That's a hierarchy, but there's also, how despotic is this hierarchy? So in the language that Michael's using, a hierarchy could be used in theory for the public good, say a public sector hierarchy. It's a giant hierarchy, say the US federal government. But in theory, or at least you hope, that it's used for the public good, for the betterment of all citizens. And certainly because it's democratic, the leaders are not billionaires. They're not sucking in resources for themselves. But there's no guarantee that a hierarchy will work that way. And what we've seen, I think, in the last 50 years of capitalism is really almost a reversion to older forms of hierarchy, where literally the owners are just trying to enrich themselves. And so we can quibble about why and how that happened. I'm not convinced it's entirely to do with financialization, but it's certainly to do with power. And it's just visible now everywhere we look. Concern for the public good among the private sector kind of has just evaporated, and gradually, the owners of billionaires, of these big corporations, really want to now completely undermine government public hierarchy. So that's one way of looking at it. And that is not necessarily the same as capital as power, although I think they're very they're coherent with each other, in the sense that you can believe that capital is power, and also that hierarchies have different dynamics. So that's what really interests me. That's been a big part of my research, and it's helped inform my view of the world.
Yeah, I think that's great, Blair, because I think even if you do want to study the concept of power, it's definitely intertwined with the rise of hierarchies and how different hierarchies manage themselves, right? So you could have, instead of a history of capitalism, a history of hierarchies, and Jonathan would probably refer to that as different modes of power. Michael, any final thoughts?
Well, the reason I spent so much time on ancient history is to find out, what is the source of power. And for me, what I found is throughout history, all ages, the source of power is creditor power, financial power, turning itself into land ownership and property owning power. It's easier to discuss this in a chart than it is to actually quantify things. But I think if you want to get power today, if you're a family and you want your children to get power, you tell them go into finance, or else go into law and sort of ride with finance and achieving one way or other, achieving financial power. That's why I've tried to distill it all into what is the ultimate, most important lever of power. And then we can all work down to how is it you could have power in financial organizations and bureaucratic power. There are all sorts of powers. But to me, I want to get to the actual center of it in order to say, how does society deal with power? How have different societies dealt with it through the ages? And is there a better way of dealing with it? Does the world have to be this way? Or how do we get rid of the sabotage that's taken place?
Thank you, Michael. And with my work on debt and money, which isn't probably as comprehensive as yours, I would tend to agree that if we kind of look at the root of this, and we haven't really discussed it in any great detail, but the history and the rise of the monetization of society, the power to create money. Obviously, you talk about it through like the idea of the creditor class and the relation between debtors and creditors. And we tend to, in Marxist parlance, talk about the working class and the capitalist class to kind of the detriment of talking about, the creditor class and power of finance. And by finance, I mean the commercial banks and their ability to issue loans versus the debtor class. So I think that's something really worthwhile to think about, not only in history, as your work has shown, but also now, even in the 21st century, we're talking about right now across pretty much the West. Cost of living crisis. There's the rise of inflation again. This, can be explained in a number of ways, which we probably can't get into today. And then the housing crisis, right? That the younger generations probably will never come to own a home, or if they do, will be paying exorbitant interest rates, and so on. So I like, pardon me, Michael, your trajectory and what you've been doing, and I can kind of see, maybe I don't have a crystal ball, nobody does, but I can see this, unless there's significant resistance, getting worse for ordinary people, for people who are vulnerable and powerless people. And Michael, you've always been an advocate for that group of people, and I appreciate your work. So thank you for those final thoughts. Jonathan, if you'd like to add your final thoughts to the discussion.
Yeah, I'd like to pick up on Michael's emphasis, which I very much like, on a kind of a long-term comparison, historical comparison of different features of power, all the way back to Sumer, as far as we know. And I think capitalism introduces something new in the nature of hierarchy. Because if you look, I mean, today, a lot of people speak about capitalism as if it is some sort of new form of feudalism. Varoufakis speaks about techno-feudalism, and it just echoes discussions from the 1930s, in which the Frankfurt School analysts spoke about political capitalism as if suddenly capitalism has been politicized. And these terms, I think, all boil down to the inability to introduce power to the very center of analysis, and therefore they need new terms to attach them to capitalism, as if capitalism has changed. And I think if we take a longer perspective on hierarchy, say if you compare the nature of hierarchy in capitalism to feudalism, you immediately see that these are very, very different types of hierarchies. So in feudalism was a very hierarchical form of organization. The network was hierarchical, but it was really different than capitalism. First of all, it was religious. Second, it was personal. The hierarchical relations were on a personal level. And thirdly, sorry, it was totalizing. So essentially, the fealty was complete. If you essentially had a feudum with a lord, you have to actually provide all the services to the lord. You had total commitment. Now, capitalism changed the nature of hierarchical relations really dramatically. The relation has become completely secular. So it's not bound by religion. It is completely impersonal. So it really doesn't depend on your personal attribute. Your contract is not at the personal level, it's at the contract level. And it's partial. So you don't have a commitment to any person or any agency that completely binds you. Limited liability is an example of how you can break things down. So the monetary nexus makes this a very flexible system. And in fact, this is why capitalism is so much more dynamic than other forms of hierarchy. And I think that there's an added element to it, that the hierarchy goes way beyond the actual organization. So the hierarchy of ideas, for example, is really very important in capitalism, and it's very hard to kind of exclude it from the discussion, although it doesn't have the same quantitative elements that are very evident in works by Blair Fix, for example. You cannot apply the same kind of empirics to it, but these types of hierarchical relations are really very crucial. And I think that in that respect, capitalism has become more adaptable than other forms of power relations, and maybe some of it, and this is kind of in a footnote, but it is probably pretty much related to Michael's analysis, this explains in some way the changing role of credit and interest because I mean, I learned that in part from Michael's work about antiquity, where the rate of interest was sort of hardwired into religious dictate. So it was, if I'm not mistaken, 33 and a third, whereas in Rome and Greece, it went down to 12% and then I think 8.5%. And in capitalism, it has been uh, essentially fluctuating. So the rate of interest is not what it used to be either in the Bronze Age or in the classical European beginning of Western civilization. It has become flexible. So in many respects, capitalist hierarchies are dynamic today in ways that other hierarchies were not. And that gives capitalism a flexibility and survivability, perhaps, that is greater than those systems. It's not as rigid and it's not as fragile that, you break those symbols, the whole thing collapses. No. Now, of course, capitalism introduces other dangers, total ecological collapse or nuclear war, things that did not exist in antiquity, at least not from the perspective of society. They came from the outside, from the gods, from nature. And these things, of course, are as important for the survival of society. But I think in terms of flexibility, capitalism is a different beast altogether. Its hierarchies are really, really dynamic. And in that respect, it is more capable to adapt. So I would be very careful not to follow Marx's footsteps and say, that we are on the verge of a collapse of the system. It has proven pretty agile in many respects.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. And that concludes our discussion. I'd like to thank Professor Jonathan Nitzan, Professor Michael Hudson, and Blair Fix for our discussion today. A very fruitful one. And gentlemen, we probably could be here for another couple hours discussing these things. There's plenty more to discuss. And hopefully in future, we can reunite and have a discussion about similar themes and maybe talk a little bit more about future trajectories of capitalism, where we think it's going. And then, and very importantly, what are potential alternatives? So insofar as we think about this mode of power or capitalism, whatever you want to call it, how do we get out of this cage if we ever do get out of this cage? So maybe that's just a metaphor for us to think about. Well, let's just end it there, gentlemen. We have gone 2 hours, 20 minutes. I'll pause it here. Stop.